All right, you can think right along with me here. We're going games of the year. We're drafting these things. I'm going to give you in order the games that I will pick if I can only go to these games. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. And I'm going to start in week 2. And I'm going down to Baton Rouge because I love it down there and they're very welcoming down there. And there's a big game down there in week 2. It's Texas at LSU. You remember this one last year? This was fun for me last year. I didn't get to go to Austin, but LSU played at Austin last year. This is the return trip of the second leg of a home and home. And there was a lot of talk in the offseason. LSU's offense is going to be this or not going to be this. They're going to be that, not going to be that. And it was really the Texas game that validated in a lot of other people's minds what some of us had thought Texas or LSU rather was going to be all along in the offseason. And granted, Texas didn't put a top 5 defensive unit on the field last year, but I mean, it's an elite program and that place was on fire and it was an early season kind of litmus test for both, but especially for Joe Burrow and LSU. Well, now you return, and they've got a national championship under their belt now, but now there's a whole lot of spotlight on both programs, but I'm thinking about it from the Texas point of view. The Texas point of view is now we're sitting here with the experience at quarterback, and we're going on the road, and most people will paint us as underdogs in this game, and if you want to have some seismic early season shift in at least the perspective, at least the idea about what Texas football is, well, that would be a very, very good win to get under your belt. Also, atmosphere is going to be out of this world insane at that game. Just the reading, Colin's showing you Tom Herman on the B-roll here if you're watching on the YouTube channel. Just thinking about the stories and the stories and the stories that you could tell about Ed Orgeron and Tom Herman. And you can mix some Jimbo Fisher in there. Ross Dellinger's done really good writing on that whole kind of. And on the outside, it seemed like a fiasco, but it seems like it was a little bit more well orchestrated the closer inside of LSU you got. And just reading and remembering about how all that stuff went down is college football is great. Then the very next week, we're going to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Georgia at Alabama. If you're from where I'm from, if you're from the South, I'm from West Central Georgia. So there was always this little triangle between Auburn and Athens and Tuscaloosa, and those were the 3 major granted, it's not a perfect triangle, but you understand what I'm saying. Those were the 3 programs when I worked down in Columbus that I covered the most. And Georgia and Alabama don't play regularly, so when they met in a national championship game, you can imagine what it was like down there. Very next year, SEC championship game. And now, yep, it's that time of century. They're going to play in the regular season, and here we go. It's another shot for Kirby Smart. It's the first shot since the Iron Bowl, really, and then the game against Michigan, for us to see Mac Jones. That's who we assume is going to start. I talked to someone pretty dialed in at Alabama yesterday about this, and as good as Bryce Young is, Mac Jones is going to start at quarterback for Alabama. I don't think that's breaking news, but fully expect Mac Jones to be starting at quarterback for Alabama in this game. That's not because Bryce Young is not something. That's because Mac Jones is something. Well, you know what else is something? The Georgia defense. And so it's going to be a really, really good test. And it also lets us see, albeit early season sample size, it lets us see where that Georgia quarterback situation is. I assume we have Jamie Newman starting. We get to see Todd Monken. We don't necessarily have the usual hornet's nest that you'd be walking into in all likelihood, playing a game on the road, because, I mean, that's not what road football looks like it's going to be this year. Hope I'm wrong, but that's not what road football looks like it's going to be this year. But it's just the first real test, and chances are, regardless of how this one turns out, chances are you're walking away saying, ooh, we very well could see these same 2 teams again down the road in Atlanta. But, man, anytime you can get those 2 locking up regular season, that is a treat to watch. Then I want to go to week 5. I talked about this game. Colin, I want to say it was last week we talked about this game. Maybe if you're on the West Coast, maybe if you're in the South, it's a little bit off your radar. But Notre Dame versus Wisconsin. This is not at Wisconsin. It's not a true road game. I mean, I guess you could count it as that. But this game is tentatively scheduled to be played in Lambeau Field. And this is a week 5 matchup. It's one of 2 major hurdles for Notre Dame. The other one, of course, being against Clemson later in the year. But I look very much forward to this one because stylistically, you play these cats from Wisconsin, and then you play a little bit later in the year Clemson. Different styles, obviously. This one, I mean, you could have frozen yourself in time in 1987 and woken up in 2020, and the style of play, with a few bells and whistles here and there added in, the style of play that you'll get from this game would be right at home in 1987. I personally love that. I think that there's potentially a lot of beauty in 16-13 outcomes. So that one's going to be smash mouth. It's going to be great. That for Wisconsin, by the way, is the week after Wisconsin goes to Michigan. So consider what we have there. I always love seeing someone go on the road, just play a big game in general, and then have another one, another losable game the next week, because for Wisconsin, I wouldn't think most people are going to expect them to beat Michigan. They'll expect to beat them, and it'll be very competitive. That'll be a single-digit point spread either way, but if they come out of that thing with a win, there you go. Wisconsin's on the national radar. Now, those of us who are pretty dialed into the game, Wisconsin's already on our radar. But those who are just casual observers, they're not thinking about Paul Chryst. They're not thinking about Wisconsin. I mean, they're not thinking about, as we call him, Jack Doan, former WWF official. In real life, his parents call him Jack Cohn. They're not thinking about him, Graham Mertz, whoever starts at quarterback there. They're thinking about the big boys. Well, if Wisconsin goes into Michigan and makes a statement, and then they're playing Notre Dame the very next week in Lambeau Field, national TV, all the trimmings, I mean, that's a 1-2 shot for Wisconsin there to really establish themselves. And of course, if Notre Dame wins that game, that is the first of two major hurdles. Now, they've got other losable games, but two major hurdles that they'll have, and then it'll be time about a month later for them to play against Clemson. More on that game in a second. All right, our third game. This is week 8. Man, I wish we could have a full house for this one. Ohio State at Penn State. I don't know that there are very many games, even including the ones that we're listing here, that I would choose to go to over this one. You know who I'm thinking about? Ironically, everyone's going to talk about Justin Fields, rightfully so. And a lot of people are going to talk about Micah Parsons, too. Let's not shortchange him, but I'm thinking about Micah Parsons. You know, when I think about these kinds of games, Micah Parsons is a linebacker, of course, for Penn State. He is a transcendent type talent. This is the kind of game, potentially, that you could talk about 10 years from now with him. It's the kind of game with a player of his caliber, there aren't many of them, that he could take over. So if you try and envision ways that games could play out, and it's the kind of game he just takes over, that'd be pretty incredible to watch. But also, we get to see Penn State's offense and Kurt Schiraka in his first year as offensive coordinator, but week 8 of his first year. You know, this isn't like when Michigan plays Washington week 1 and, you know, no one really knows what to expect on either side. This is week 8. So we'll have a pretty good sample size of what we've seen offensively from Penn State so far. And we'll have a decent idea, you know, is there enough firepower here? Can they stretch the field enough? Can they trade points with Ohio State, or do they need to turn it into a brick fight early on? And secondly, if they beat Ohio State, the story writes itself. If they don't, how competitive is it? Because I've gone over this little scenario many times with you, that I think Penn State is the most likely. And since I've said this, I've seen some people jump on. There are only so many different takes you can have. I'm not claiming intellectual forgery at all, but I'm saying Penn State is the most likely non-conference champion to make the playoff. Normally it's an SEC team. This year I think it's Penn State. So you can't be saying that if you get blown out 42-6 or something like that. So you got to make it competitive even if you lose. All right, the very next week, we're going down to Jacksonville. This is Georgia versus Florida. I cannot convey to you in strong enough terms how toxic things will turn, how angst-ridden things will turn in the losing fan base of this game. Doesn't matter. Now, if you're outside of the rivalry and you're just an innocent bystander, it's kind of fun to watch. But believe me, I had some pushback on this from some Florida folks, but I believe I understand the Florida fan base enough to know they're all in. They all think they're going to win the East. A lot of other people agree with them. If they can't clear this hurdle again, if they try again to clear that red and black hurdle, and they fall on their face, and they haven't been embarrassed, but they haven't gotten the job done. If they fall on their face again, knowing full well, as they think they do, that they've got several advantages over Georgia now that they normally don't have, and they're just left, you know, kind of relegated to maybe a New Year's Six bowl if some other teams make room for us, that's not going to be good enough for Florida this year. So that's on one side. On the other side, no one in Athens, Georgia, and beyond is ready to take a step back. Losing to Florida to them would be a step back. Like in their mind, they've distanced themselves from having to worry about that. In the hierarchy of the SEC East, it's them. We're parked at the top, and the only way that we have to go is up, and there's only one more step that we can take up, and that's winning a national championship. Well, all of a sudden that gets derailed potentially if you lose this one. So, as I said, this one, it's sort of a sadistic way to think about it, but I'm excited to watch that one just as much for what it's like for the losing program exiting that week as I am for the winning program. Is that bad? Is that wrong? It's probably wrong. Well, let's move on. Notre Dame, never let it be said we don't talk about the Irish a lot here. They, in our final game here, are featured a second time. Notre Dame welcomes in Clemson. That is a Week 10 game. Yeah, Notre Dame gets another shot. For Notre Dame, it's like you play Alabama 8 years ago and people are still talking about it. And then you played Clemson in a semifinal game a few years ago. And then you got Georgia last year on the road. But because you don't have a schedule load, like you don't play in the SEC West, so you don't get an annual chance to atone for this stuff necessarily, unless you make the playoff every year. This is another shot for them. They were competitive at Georgia last year. Well, this is another shot. And they get them at home. Can you imagine for a second? No one's thinking about this. Everyone thinks Clemson's going to win this game. Can you imagine if Brian Kelly were to pull that game off? Let me tell you what it does. First off, it may knock Clemson out of the playoff. That's first. Secondly, it's obviously thrusting Notre Dame right into the playoff conversation if they're not already there. But any time previously that Notre Dame's been in the playoff conversation, think about what it's been. What it's been is, if we're going to make it, I hope we get Notre Dame in the first round. Like, remember a couple of years ago, the big beef that Alabama folks had was, how come Clemson gets to play Notre Dame and we have to play Oklahoma when we're the number 1 seed? I mean, like, people were fighting to be able to play them. Well, all of a sudden, if Notre Dame beats Clemson, obviously they were a caliber of team good enough to beat Clemson if they pull it off. Then all of a sudden, I wonder what their prospects look like for the playoff. I wonder if everyone's quite as anxious to play against them. I mean, how has the game gone? Have they pulled it off with a +4 turnover margin? Did they play them straight up and just knock them back? I mean, how did they pull this game off? Was there injury somewhere that was very significant for Clemson? Or does Clemson go in there and win 34-17? So those are the games that I picked. There are obviously more big games. Like, for instance, who wouldn't want to be in Eugene, Oregon in week 2 for Ohio State at Oregon? I couldn't go there because I was already in Baton Rouge. See, this is what's kind of aggravating. Like that week, for instance, that Clemson plays Notre Dame. I mean, that's also LSU Alabama week. I ask every year. I don't ask for much. I don't even ask for multiple shirts. I just wear the same one. But in exchange for having a very limited wardrobe, why can't you guys just let me make the schedule? I don't think it's too much to ask.